Hey, welcome back to another experimental live read from Adult Brain. I'm Graham, one of the narrators. This is the last two chapters of part one, The Drift, from Ignatius Donnelly's book published in 1883 called Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel. So these chapters are chapter 7, The Drift, a gigantic catastrophe, and 8, Great Heat, a prerequisite. And then tomorrow I'll start on part 2. So please, like and smash that like button and subscribe and all that stuff, and we'll jump right into it. This is raw and rough, and I'm gonna share my screen here and just show you how the sausage is made, basically. I forgot to do that yesterday for a while. So here is the PDF here that I'll be scrolling through as I read it and try and stall on the rough pictures that are shown in this book. Chapter 7. The Drift, a gigantic catastrophe. In the first place, the drift fell upon a fair and lovely world, a world far better adapted to give happiness to its inhabitants than this storm-tossed planet on which we now live, with its endless battle between heat and cold, between sun and ice. The pre-glacial world was a garden, a paradise, not excessively warm at the equator, and yet with so mild and equable climate. Better redo that guy. Not I'm gonna try not snort and cough like I do when I'm alone. My sinuses always kind of loosen up after a while. The pre-glacial the pre-glacial world was a garden, a paradise, not excessively warm at the equator, and yet with so mild and equable a climate that the plants we now call tropical flourished within the present Arctic Circle. If some future daring navigator reaches the North Pole and finds solid land there, he will probably discover in the rocks at his feet the fossil remains of the oranges and bananas of the pre-glacial age. Let the reader That the reader may not think this an extravagant statement, let me cite a few authorities. A recent writer says, "This was indeed for America the golden age of animals and plants, and in all respects but one, the absence of man, the country was more interesting and picturesque than now. We must imagine, therefore, that the hills and valleys about the present site of New York were covered with noble trees and a dense undergrowth of species, for the most part different from those now living there, and that these were the homes and feeding grounds of many kinds of quadrupeds and birds, which have long since become extinct. The broad plain which sloped gently expand this PDF here. Let's see, where was I? Become extinct. The broad plain which The broad plain which sloped gently seaward from the highlands must have been covered with a subtropical forest of giant trees and tangled vines teeming with animal life. This state of things doubtless continued through many thousands of years, but ultimately a change came over the fair face of nature, more complete and terrible than we have language to describe. Another says, at the close of the Tertiary Age, which ends the long series of geological epochs previous to the Quaternary, the landscape of Europe had, in the main, assumed its modern appearance. The middle era of this age, the Miocene, was characterized by tropical plants, a varied and imposing fauna, and a genial climate so extended as to nourish forests of beeches, maples, walnuts, poplars, and magnolias in Greenland and Spitsbergen, while an exotic vegetation hid the exuberant valleys of England. Dr. Dawson says, this delightful climate was not confined to the present temperature of tropical regions. It extended to the very shores of the Arctic Sea. In North Greenland at Atane Kurdluk, in latitude 70° north, at an elevation of more than 1,000 feet above the sea were found the do that one again. In North In North Greenland, at Attain Kurdluk in latitude 70° north, at an elevation of more than 1,000 feet above the sea, were found the remains of beeches, oaks, pines, poplars, maples, walnuts, magnolias, limes, and vines. The remains of similar plants were found in Spitsbergen in latitude 78 degrees 56 minutes. Dr. Dawson continues, was the Miocene period on the whole a better age of the world than that which in Was the Miocene period on the whole a better age of the world than that in which we live? In some aspects, it was. Uh, in some respects, it was. Obviously, there was in the northern hemisphere a vast surface of land under a mild and equable climate, and clothed with a rich and varied vegetation. Had we lived in the Miocene, we might have sat under our own vine and fig tree equally in Greenland and Spitsbergen, and in those more southern climes to which this privilege is now restricted. Some reasons have been adduced for the belief that in the Miocene and Eocene there were intervals of cold climate, but the evidence of this be but the evidence of this may be merely local and exceptional and does not interfere with the broad characteristics of the age. Sir Edward Belcher, brought away from the dreary shores of Wellington Channel, latitude 75° 32 minutes north. This volume keeps going down automatically. I hope it's going to be okay on the audio recording. Latitude 75° 32 minutes north. Portions latitude 75° 32 minutes north. Portions of a tree which there can be no doubt whatever had actually grown where he found it. The roots were in place in a frozen mass of earth, the stump standing upright where it was probably overtaken by the great winter. Trees have been found in situ on Prince Patrick's Island in latitude 76° 12 minutes north, 4 feet in circumference. They were so old that the wood had lost its combustible quality and refused to burn. Mr. Geeky thinks that it's possible these trees were preglacial and belonged to the Miocene age. They may have been the remnants of the great forests which clothed that far northern region when the so-called glacial age came on and brought the drift. We shall see hereafter that man, possibly civilized man, dwelt in this far and glorious world. This world that knew no frost, no cold, no ice, no snow, that he had dwelt in it for thousands of years, that he witnessed the appalling and sudden calamity which fell upon it, and that he has preserved the memory of this catastrophe to the present day, in a multitude of myths and legends scattered all over the face of the habitable earth. But was it sudden? Was it a catastrophe? Again, I call the witness to the stand, for I ask you, good reader, to accept nothing that is not proved. In the first place, was it sudden? One writer says, the glacial action, in the opinion of the land glacialists, was limited to a definite period and operated simultaneously over a vast area. And again, the drift was accumulated where it is by some violent action. Louis Figuier says, the two cataclysms of which we have spoken surprised Europe at the moment of the development of an important creation. The whole scope of animated nature, the evolution of animals, was suddenly arrested in that part of our hemisphere over which these gigantic convulsions spread, followed by the brief but sudden submersion of an entire continent. Organic life had scarcely recovered from the violent shock when a second and perhaps several Check. Organic life had scarcely recovered from the violent shock when a second and perhaps severe blow assailed it. The northern and central parts of Europe, the vast countries which extend from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean and the Danube, were visited by a period of sudden and severe cold. The temperature of the polar regions seized them. The plains of Europe, but now ornamented by the luxurious vegetation developed by the heat of a burning climate, the boundless pastures on which herds of great elephants, the active horse, the robust hippopotamus, and great carnivorous animals grazed and roamed, became covered with a mantle of ice and snow. Monsieur C.H. Martius says, the most violent convulsions of the solid and liquid elements appear to have been themselves only the effects due to a cause much more powerful than the mere expansion of the pyrosphere, and it is necessary to recur, in order to explain them, to some new and bolder hypothesis than has yet been hazarded. Some philosophers have belief in an astronomical revolution which may have overtaken our globe in the first age of its formation, and have modified its position in relation to the sun. They admit that the poles have not always been as they are now, and that some terrible shock displaced them, changing at the same time the inclination of the axis of the rotation of the Earth. Interesting about the poles. I was thinking about that. Louis Figuier says, we cannot doubt after such testimony of the existence in the frozen north of the almost entire remains of the mammoth. The animals seem to have perished suddenly, enveloped in ice at the moment of their death. Their bodies have been preserved from decomposition by the continual action of the cold. Cuvier says, speaking of the bodies of the quadrupeds which the ice had seized, and which have been preserved with their hair, flesh, and skin down to our own times. If they had not been frozen as soon as killed, putrefaction would have decomposed them. And on the other hand, this eternal frost could not have previously prevailed in the place where they died, for they could not have lived in such a temperature. It was therefore at the same instant when these animals perished that the country they inhabited was rendered glacial. These events must have been sudden, instantaneous, and without any gradation. There is abundant evidence that the drift fell upon a land covered with forests, and that the trunks of the trees were swept into the mass of clay and gravel, where they are preserved to this day. Mr. Whittlesley gives an account of a log found 40 feet below the surface, in a bed of blue clay, resting upon the hard pan or till in a well dug at Columbia, Ohio. At Bloomington, Illinois, pieces of wood were found 123 feet below the surface, in sinking a shaft. And it is a very remarkable fact that none of these Illinois clay contain any fossils. Check. And it is a very remarkable fact that none of these Illinois clays contain any fossils. The inference, therefore, is irresistible that the clay, thus unfalciferous, there's that word again, unfalciferous, The inference, therefore, is irresistible that the clay, the inference, therefore, is irresistible that the clay, thus unfalciferous, the inference, therefore, is irresistible that the clay, thus unfalciferous, fell upon and enclosed the trees while they were yet growing. These facts alone would dispose of the theory that the drift was deposited upon lands already covered with water. It is evident, on the contrary, that it was dry land, inhabited land, land embowered in forests. On top of the Norwich Crag in England are found the remains of an ancient forest, showing stumps of trees standing erect with their roots penetrating an ancient soil. In this soil occur the remains of many extinct species of animals, together with those of others still living. Among these may be mentioned the hippopotamus, 3 species of elephant, the mammoths, rhinoceros, bear, horse, Irish elk, etc. In Ireland, remains the trees have been check. In Ireland, remains of trees have been found in sand beds below the till. Dr. Dawson found a hardened peaty bed. Peaty bed. Peaty bed. Canada. Dr. Dawson found a hardened peaty bed under the boulder clay in Canada, which contained many small roots and branches, apparently of coniferous trees allied to the spruces. Mr. C. Whittlesley referred to decayed leaves and remains of the elephant and mastodon found below in the drift in America. The remains of the mastodon, rhinoceros, hippopotamus, and elephant are found in the preglacial beds of Italy. These animals were slaughtered outright and so suddenly that few escaped. Admiral Wrangel tells us that the remains of elephants, rhinoceroses, etc., are heaped up in such quantities in certain parts of Siberia that he and his men climbed over ridges and mounds composed entirely of their bones. We have seen that the drift itself has all the appearance of having been the product of some sudden catastrophe. Stones and boulders alike are scattered higgledy-piggledy pell-mell throughout the clay, so as to give it a highly confused and tumultuous appearance. Another writer says, in the mass of the till itself, fossils sometimes but rarely occur. Tusks of the mammoth, reindeer antlers, and fragments of wood have from time to time been discovered. They almost invariably afford marks of having been subjected to the same action as the stones and boulders by which they are surrounded. Look at all the notes there, too. All his quotes are from scientific papers and magazines, Smithsonian stuff, glacialists. Another says, logs and fragments of wood are often got at great depths in the buried gorges. Mr. Geeky says, below a deposit of till at Wood Hill Quarry near Kilmars in Ayrshire, Scotland, the remains of mammoths and reindeer and certain marine shells have several times been detected during the quarrying operations. 2 elephant tusks were got at a depth of 17.5 feet from the surface. The mammalian remains obtained from this quarry occurred in a peaty layer between 2 thin beds of sand and gravel, which lay beneath a massive till and rested directly on the sandstone rock. Check. And again, remains of the mammoth have been met with at Chapel Hall near Airdrie, where they occurred in a bed of laminated sand underlying till. Reindeer antlers have also been discovered in other localities, as in the valley of the Endrick, about 4 miles from Loch Lomond, where an antler was found associated with marine shells near the bottom of a bed of blue clay and close to the underlying rock. The blue clay being covered with 12 feet of tough, stony clay. Professor Winchell says, buried tree trunks are often exhumed from the glacial drift at a depth of from 20 to 60 feet from the surface. Dr. Locke was published on account of a mass of buried driftwood at Salem, Ohio, 43 feet below the surface, embedded in ancient mud. The Museum of the University of Michigan contains several fragments of well-preserved tree trunks exhumed from wells in the vicinity of Ann Arbor. Such occurrences are by no means uncommon. The encroachments of the waves upon the shores of the Great Lakes reveal whole forests of buried trunks of the white cedar. These citations place it beyond question that the drift came suddenly upon the world, slaughtering the animals, breaking up the forests, and overwhelming the trunks and branches of the trees in its masses of debris. Let us turn to the next question. Was it an extraordinary event, a world-shaking cataclysm? The answer to this question is plain. The drift marks probably the most awful convulsion and catastrophe that has ever fallen upon the globe. The deposits of these the deposits of these check. The deposit of these continental masses of clay The deposit of these continental masses of clay, sand, and gravel was but one of the features of the appalling event. In addition to this, the earth at the same time was cleft with great cracks or fissures, which reached down through many miles of the planet's crust to the central fires and released the boiling rocks imprisoned in its bosom. And these poured to the surface as igneous, intrusive, or trap rocks. Where the great breaks were not deep enough to reach the central fires, they left mighty fissures in the surface, which in the Scandinavian regions are known as fjords, and which constitute a striking feature of the scenery of those northern lands. They are great canals, hewn as it were in the rock, with high walls penetrating from the sea far into the interior of the land. They are found in Great Britain, Maine, Nova Scotia, Labrador, Greenland, and on the western coast of North America. David Dale Owens tells us David Dale Owen tells us that the outburst of trap rock at the Dalles of the St. Croix. Should I read that in English or French? It's supposed to be Croix, Dalles of St. Croix, but it's supposed to go that way. Come on. And on the western coast of North America. Dalles, St. Croix. Croix would be French, but Croix, let's go with that. David Dale Owen tells us that the outburst of trap rock at the Dalles of the St. Croix came up through open fissures, breaking the continuity of strata without tilting them into inclined planes. It would appear as if the earth in the first place cracked into deep clefts, and the igneous matter which check. It would appear as if the earth in the first place cracked into deep clefts, and the igneous matter within took advantage of these breaks to rise to the surface. It caught masses of the sandstone in its midst and hardened around them. These great clefts seem to be, as Owen says, lines radiating southwestwardly from Lake Superior, as if that was the seat of the disturbance which caused them. Moreover, when we come to examine the face of the rocks on which the drift came, we do not find them merely smoothed and ground down as we might suppose a great heavy mass of ice moving slowly over them would leave them. There was something more than this. There was something, whatever it was, that fell upon them with awful force and literally smashed them, pounding, beating, pulverizing them, and turning one layer of mighty rock upon over another. Should I redo that? There was something more than this. There was something, whatever it was, that fell upon them with awful force and literally smashed them, pounding, beating, pulverizing them, and turning one layer of mighty rock over upon another, and scattering them in the Oh boy. There was something more than this. There was something, whatever it was, that fell upon them with awful force and literally smashed them, pounding, beating, pulverizing them, and turning one layer of mighty rock over upon another, and scattering them in the wildest confusion. We cannot conceive of anything terrestrial that, let loose upon the bare rocks today, would or could produce such results. Geeky says, When the till is removed from the underlying rocks, these almost invariably show either a well smoothed, polished, and striated surface, or else a highly confused, broken, and smashed appearance. Gradicap says, crushed ledges designate those plicated, overthrown, or curved exposures where parallel rocks, as talcose schist, usually vertical, are bent and fractured, as if by a maul like force battering them from above. Fascinating. I bet you they don't accept all this science nowadays. The strata are oftentimes tumbled over upon a cliffside like a row of books and rest upon heaps of fragments broken away by the strain upon the bottom layers or crushed off from their exposed layers. The Rev. O. Fisher, FGS, says he finds the covering beds to consist of two members, a lower one entirely destitute of organic remains and generally unstratified, which has often been forcibly indented into the bed beneath it, sometimes exhibiting slicken sides? Slicken sides? Finds, finds, says he, slicken sides at the junction. Slicken sides. Finds the covering beds to consist of two members, a lower one entirely destitute of organic remains and generally unstratified, which has often been forcibly indented into the bed beneath it, sometimes exhibiting slicken sides at the junction. There is evidence of this lower member having been pushed or dragged over the surface from higher to lower levels in a plastic condition, on which account he has named it the trail. Now, all these details are incompatible with the idea of ice action. What condition of ice can be imagined that would smash rocks, that would beat them like a maul, that would indent them? And when we pass from the underlying rocks to the till itself, we find the evidences of tremendous force exerted in the wildest and most tumultuous manner. When the clay and stones were being deposited on those crushed and pounded rocks, they seem to have picked up the detritus of the earth in great masses and whirled it wildly in among their own material and deposited it in what are called the intercalated intercalated the intercalated beds. Oh boy, I'm gonna go back for a while here. This one. When the intercalated. When the clay and stones were being deposited on those crushed and pounded rocks, they seemed to have picked up the detritus of the earth in great masses and whirled it wildly in among their own material and deposited it in what are called the intercalated beds. It would seem as if cyclonic winds had been at work among the mass. While the till itself is devoid of fossils, the intercalated beds often contain them. Whatever was in or on the soil was seized upon, carried up into the air, then cast down and mingled among the till. James Geeky says, speaking of these intercalated beds, they are twisted, bent, crumpled, and confused often in the wildest manner. Layers of clay, sand, and gravel, which were probably deposited in a nearly horizontal plane, are puckered into folds and sharply curved into vertical positions. I have seen whole beds of sand and clay which had all the appearance of having been pushed forward bodily for some distance, the bedding assuming the most fantastic appearance. The intercalated beds are everywhere cut through by the overlying till, and large portions have been carried away. They form but a small fraction of the drift deposits. In the accompanying cut, we have one of these sand and clay patches embosomed in the till, and again. How does that end right there? So we have the cut here, stratified beds in Till, Leithen Water, Peebleshire, Scotland, and another one here at section at Joinville. I gotta figure out how that sentence end there. Till and it just till and T1 and T, I guess till. I'm gonna take that away. And again, the same writer says the intercalated. And again, the same writer says the intercalated beds are remarkable for having yielded an imperfect skull of the great extinct ox, Bos primigenius, and remains of the Irish elk or deer and the horse, together with layers of peaty matter. Several of our foremost scientists see in the phenomena of the drift the evidences of a cataclysm of some sort. Sir John Lubbock gives the following representation of a section of the drift at Joinville, France, containing an immense sandstone block, 8 feet 6 inches in length, with a width of 2 feet 8 inches and thickness of 3 feet 4 inches. Discussing the subject, Mr. Lubbock says, "We must feel that a body of water with power to move such masses as these must have been very different from any floods now occurring in those valleys, and might well deserve the name of a cataclysm. But a flood which could bring down so great a mass would certainly have swept away the comparatively light and movable gravel below. We cannot, therefore, account for the phenomena by aqueous action, because a flood which would deposit the sandstone blocks would remove the underlying gravel, and a flood which would deposit the gravel would not remove the blocks." Wow. Deus ex machina. The Deus ex machina has not only been called in most unnecessarily, but when examined turns out to be but an idol after all. Sir John thinks that floating ice may have dropped these blocks, but then, on the other hand, M.C. d'Aubigny, I had the guy's pronunciation somewhere. I had it right, but d'Aubigny, C. d'Aubigny, M.C. d'Aubigny. I better go back. Sir John thinks that floating ice might have dropped these blocks, but then, on the other hand, M.C. d'Aubigny observes that all the fossils found in these beds belong to freshwater or land animals. The sea has had nothing to do with them, and d'Aubigny thinks the drift came from cataclysms. I think I checked that guy's name out too. Perta. Boucher Perta. Monsieur Boucher de Perta, the first and most exhaustive investigator of these deposits, has always been of opinion that the drift gravels of France were deposited by violent cataclysms. This view seems to be confirmed by the fact that the gravel beds in which these remains of man and extinct animals are found lie at an elevation of from 80 to 200 feet above the present water levels of the valleys. Sir John Lubbock says, "Our second difficulty still remains, namely, the height at which the upper level gravels stand above the present waterline. We cannot wonder that these beds have generally been attributed to violent cataclysms. In America, in Britain, and in Europe, the glacial deposits made clean work of nearly all animal life." Check. The great mammalia, too large to find shelter in caverns, were some of them utterly swept away. The great mammalia, too large to find shelter in caverns, were some of them utterly swept away, while others never afterward returned to those regions. In like manner, Paleolithic man, man of the rude and unpolished flint implements, the contemporary of the great mammalia, the mammoth, the hippopotamus, and the rhinoceros, was also stamped out, and the cave deposits of Europe show that there was a long interval before he reappeared in those regions. The same forces, whatever they were, which smashed and pounded and contorted the surface of the earth, crushed man and his gigantic associates out of existence. But in Siberia, where we have seen some of the large mammalia were caught and entombed in ice, and preserved even to our own day, there was no smashing and crushing of the earth, and many escaped the snow sheets, and their posterity survived in that region for long ages after the glacial period, and are supposed only to have disappeared in quite recent times. In fact, within the last 2 or 3 years, a Russian exile declared that he had seen a group of living mammoths in a wild valley in a remote portion of that wilderness. These, then, good reader, to recapitulate, are points that seem to be established. 1. The drift marked a world convulsing catastrophe. It was a gigantic and terrible event. It was something quite out of the ordinary course of nature's operations. 2. It was sudden and overwhelming. 3. It fell upon land areas much like our own in geographical conformation, a forest covered inhabited land, a glorious land, basking in perpetual summer in the midst of a golden age. Let us go a step further. Chapter 8. Great heat, a prerequisite. Now, it will be observed that the principal theories assigned for the drift go upon the hypothesis that it was produced by extraordinary masses of ice. Ice as icebergs, ice as glaciers, or ice in continental sheets. The scientists admit that immediately preceding this glacial age, the climate was mild and equable, and these great formations of ice did not exist. But none of them pretend to say how the ice came or what caused it. Even Agassiz, the great apostle of the ice origin of drift, even Ag- Even Agassiz, the great apostle of the ice origin of drift, is forced to confess. We have as yet no clue to the source of this great and sudden change of climate. Various suggestions have been made, among others, that formerly the inclination of the Earth's axis was greater, or that a submersion of the continents under water might have produced a decided increase of cold. But none of these explanations are satisfactory, and science has yet to find any cause which accounts for all the phenomena connected with it. Some have imagined that a change in the position of the Earth's axis of rotation, due to the elevation of extensive mountain tracts between the poles and the equator, might have caused a degree of, excuse me. Some Some have imagined that a change in the position of the Earth's axis of rotation, due to the elevation of extensive mountain tracts between the poles and the equator, might have caused a degree of cold sufficient to produce the phenomena of the drift. But Geeky says, check, check. It has been demonstrated that the protuberance of the Earth at the equator so vastly exceeds that any possible elevation of mountain passes between the equator and the poles, that any slight changes which may have resulted from such geological causes could have only an infinitesimal effect upon the general climate of the globe. Let us reason together. The ice, say the glacialists, caused the drift. What caused the ice? Great rains and snows, they say, falling on the face of the land. What? Great rains and snows, they say, falling on the face of the land. Granted, what is rain in the first instance? Vapor, clouds. Whence are the clouds derived? From the waters of the earth, principally from the oceans. How is the water in the clouds transferred to the clouds from the seas? By evaporation. What is necessary to evaporation? Heat. Here, then, is the sequence. If there is no heat, there is no evaporation. No evaporation, no clouds. No clouds, no rain, no rain, no ice. No ice, no drift. But as the glacial age meant ice on a stupendous scale, then it must have been preceded by heat on a stupendous scale. Professor Tyndall asserts that the ancient glaciers indicate the action of heat as much as cold. He says, "Cold will not produce glaciers. You may have the bitterest northeast winds here in London throughout the winter without a single flake of snow. Cold must have the fitting object to operate upon, and this object, the aqueous vapor of the air, is the direct product of heat. Let us put this glacier question in another form. The latent heat of aqueous vapor at the temperature of its production in the tropics is about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. For the latent heat augments as the temperature of evaporation descends. A pound of water thus vaporized at the equator has absorbed 1,000 times the quantity of heat which would raise a pound of the liquid 1 degree in temperature. It is perfectly manifest that by weakening the sun's action, either through a defect of emission or by the steeping of the entire solar system in space of a low temperature, we should be cutting off the glaciers at their source." Mr. Kroll says, "Heat to produce evaporation is just as essential to the accumulation of snow and ice as cold to produce condensation." Sir John Lubbock says, "Paradoxical as it may appear, the primary cause of the glacial epoch may be, after all, an elevation of the temperature in the tropics, causing a greater amount of evaporation in the equatorial regions, and consequently a greater supply of the raw material of snow in the temperate regions during the winter months." Check, check. So necessary did it appear that heat must have come from some source to vaporize all this vast quantity of water that one gentleman, Professor Frankland, suggested that the ocean must have been rendered hot by the infernal. I was about to say infernal. Infernal. I mean, maybe infernal is also appropriate. So necessary. So necessary did it appear that heat must have come from some source to vaporize all this vast quantity of water that one gentleman, Professor Frankland, suggested that the ocean must have been rendered hot by the internal fires of the earth, and thus the water was sent up in clouds to fall in ice and snow. But Sir John Lubbock disposes of this theory by showing that the fauna of the seas during the glacial period possessed an Arctic character. We cannot conceive of Greenland shells and fish and animals thriving in an ocean nearly at the boiling point. A writer in the Popular Science Monthly says, "These evidences of vast accumulations of ice and snow on the borders of the Atlantic have led some theorists to suppose that the ice period was attended, if not in part caused, by a far more abundant evaporation from the surface of the Atlantic than takes place at present, and it has even been conjectured that submarine volcanoes in the tropics might have loaded the atmosphere with an unusual amount of moisture. This speculation seems to me, however, both improbable and superfluous. Improbable because no traces of any such cataclysm have been discovered, and it is more than doubtful whether the generation of steam in the tropics, however large the quantity, would produce glaciation of the polar regions. The ascent of steam and heated air loaded with vapor to the attitude of refrigeration The ascent of steam and air loaded with vapor to the altitude of refrigeration would, as it seems to me, result in the rapid radiation of the heat into space and the local precipitation of unusual quantities of rain. and the effect of such a catastrophe would be slowly propagated and feebly felt in the Arctic and Antarctic regions. When we consider the magnitude of ice sheets, which it is claimed by the glacialists covered the continents during the Drift Age, it becomes evident that a vast proportion of the waters of the ocean must have been evaporated and carried into the air, and thence cast down as snow and rain. Sir Thomas Belt, in a recent number of the Quarterly Journal of Science, argues that the formation of ice sheets at the poles must have lowered the level of the oceans of the world 2,000 feet. The mathematician can figure it out for himself. Take the area of the continents down to, say, latitude 40 degrees on both sides of the equator. Suppose this area to be covered by an ice sheet averaging, say, 2 miles in thickness. Reduce this mass of ice to cubic feet of water, and estimate what proportion of the ocean would be required to be vaporized to create it. Calculated upon any basis, and it follows that the level of the ocean must have been greatly lowered. What a vast, inconceivable accession to heat to our atmosphere was necessary to lift this gigantic layer of ocean water out of its bed and into the clouds. The ice, then, was not the cause of the cataclysm. It was simply one of the secondary consequences. We must look, then, behind the Ice Age for some cause that would prodigiously increase the heat of our atmosphere. And when we have found that, we shall have discovered the cause of the drift deposits as well as of the ice. The solution of the whole stupendous problem is, therefore, heat, not cold. And part 2 coming up tomorrow, the comet, chapter 1. A comet caused the drift. So we're getting into Ragnarok, the comet. Thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks for listening. We'll see you tomorrow.